Where must this So the next week. The next week. It's very. That's all right. Okay, thanks everyone. I think we've just got that academic 5 minutes we just hit, so we can get going. And I would like to welcome you all in the house, welcome some of the people online. And it's really a great pleasure for me to introduce Jess' presentation today, because it's research she's going to present an overview of her PhD. Jess is doing her PhD at the University of Plymouth, but through some funding from the UK Deutsche Bank, we have managed to get her here as part of what we call Leviathan project. I don't know, some of you will know that Nobushe from our research team, and the year before, Jabulani also went to the University of Plymouth for spending a visiting research of 3 months. And so we get our last cherry on top, we get to host Jess. And unfortunately, we're all very sad because she's already leaving next week. But her project that she's carried on here between November, then going back home and then coming back, it's really been intense. And she's going to tell you a little bit on that project as well, because this study is integral part of your PhD. But Jess is working on coastal ecological engineering. I know that some of you in the house, because of the research that our research team carries on, know about it, but I don't want to leave out anything, and I'll leave Jess to introduce her work and her PhD. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. So my name's Jess. And as Francesca said, I'm based at the University of Plymouth, which is in the very southwest of the UK. I'm working on my PhD, which is looking at greening of grey infrastructure, if you're familiar with the term, making space for nature on global coastlines. So to really understand greening of grey infrastructure, we first need to understand this concept of ocean sprawl. So currently, around 40% of our global population lives within 100 kilometres of our global coastlines. That is a really large portion of our population, all kind of confined within these small land areas. And what this means is that we demand a lot from our coastal environments. So I've got some photos here. These are all around the coast of South Africa, but I have a slide that I've used when I've been in Plymouth, and the slide looks almost identical. There's a huge variety of requirements that we use our coastlines for. You can see here transport, we've got luxury housing, recreation, there's military and all a massive range of different uses. And when we use our coastlines in this way, we amend them, we change them, we make them increasingly artificial. These structures differ greatly from the natural habitats that once were in place of these. So these could have been rocky shores, beaches, salt marshes. We've replaced all of these habitats with these artificial structures. And that doesn't go without consequences. So you may be familiar with a rocky shore, for example, huge amounts of physical complexity and biological complexity. When you look in crevices, you can see a huge variety of different organisms. Flat, featureless, maybe vertical. They often harbour far fewer species than our natural counterparts. This doesn't just impact the things that we see when we go rock pooling. This has very real impacts on the services that we receive from our coastlines. We require organisms to filter water, to sequester carbon. We rely on a lot of coastal species for food. And we lose a lot of these really valuable services when we artificialise our coastlines. So we've got to try and find a way to balance this problem. We need these coastal structures. We have a large population. It's ever increasing. And we do need those structures to protect land, to provide infrastructure. But we also need to make sure there's space for nature on these coastlines. And so that's where greening of grey infrastructure comes in. So greening of grey infrastructure is the concept in which artificial structures that have a primary human function are amended and enhanced by incorporating ecological measures as well. So the premise is that we're trying to find a middle ground between the human structures that we require and the space that nature needs on our coastlines. And so we've got just a very few number of examples here because they're really increasing in number. Here we've got, for example, on a seawall, these are called vertipools. So they're effectively rock pools that have been bolted and attached onto a vertical seawall to retain water at low tide. So generally, if you think of a flat seawall at low tide, no moisture is being retained. Any organisms there are really vulnerable to predation due to lack of kind of physical complexity. And so when you add in something just as simple as this tiny water retaining feature, you can really bolster the biodiversity on those structures. This down here is a kind of slight level up from that, which is the incorporation of habitat panels. So this is the Living Seawall in Plymouth, which is a project that I've been working on. And effectively, in this example, there are 6 different types of panels, and each panel mimics a natural structure. So you've got, for example, here, this mimics the root structure of kelp, a kelp holdfast. We've got rock pool tiles, we've got oyster reefs here. There's a big range of all of these different habitats that we know in the wild harbour this amazing natural biodiversity. So we're trying to mimic those physical structures and basically apply them onto our flat, featureless infrastructure. This was a photo from very early on in the Living Seawalls in Plymouth project. I think this was actually only 2 weeks after it went in. As you can see, these tiles here are very grey. They had been put in at a tidal cycle after those tiles in the middle. And you can see how quickly those biofilms and algae start growing. So it is a really rapid process. I would show you a photo from more recently, but unfortunately you lose all the beautiful complexity in the tiles because things grow on them and they disguise them. So here we've got an example of a different type of infrastructure. This is a groin block, which is basically put into these large groin structures and beaches. And what would otherwise be kind of flat featureless boulders have been purposefully enhanced with crevices and holes and rock pools, again, to add that physical complexity. And like I mentioned, when all the seaweed's covering it, you can't see those amazing complexities, but it is really a testament to how it can really improve those structures. So this is all great, and there are really measurable ecological benefits in a lot of examples of greening of grey infrastructure, but it's really not quite as simple as saying a one-size-fits-all, it's this amazing kind of premise with no caveats, because that isn't reflective of the situation at all. And there are actually a few key challenges with greening of grey infrastructure, or GGI as I might refer to it, that I explored during my PhD, which is still ongoing, so there might not be tons of results yet. Yeah, so I explored some of these key challenges, and I'll present some of them to you and then kind of go into more detail as to how we tried to tackle them with various projects. So 3 of these key challenges, the first of which being the evidence base is really fragmented. It's an increasing research science, and we are getting more and more information about this, but it's very sporadic and it's in different kind of areas, which I'll explain in more detail in a moment. But we're really trying to pull together this cohesive kind of knowledge base, which is quite challenging when everything is so spread out. We also lack insights into public perceptions of GGI. There's a huge amount of ecological research that's increasing, but actually we miss a lot of those kind of social and public perceptions. when we just focus on this kind of ecological aspect. So it's really important to broaden our view as well. And finally, most interventions rely on more artificial structures. You could see in those previous examples, all of those were just examples where more concrete has been added. We've just chucked more concrete at a wall. It's a bit more complex and it's fantastic, but there are obviously real caveats to that as well. So that's the final thing I wanted to explore during my project. So the first challenge, the fragmented evidence base. So at present, the majority of installations are small and they're for short timescales. As many of you know, research funding is hard to come by and often for short periods of time. And so the majority of the installations we see are on quite a small scale. So Living Seawall in Plymouth, for example, it was one of the biggest eco-engineering or greening of grey infrastructure installations of its kind in the UK. And even that is only 12 metres, which was a huge project for us to get off the ground. But if you think about the huge amounts of artificial structure along our coastlines, it's really a tiny portion. And again, short time scales, you might have funding for 2 years, but then what happens after? We have those initial successional stages and we know those species that come quickly, but how does that translate through time and how do those communities change? We also have really disconnected reporting. It's not just researchers that are implementing practices like this. Industry professionals and governments are beginning more and more to implement GGI practices. What happens here is researchers may publish in journals, industry professionals may then kind of show their results in brochures to make you buy their product, and maybe governments report in these large policy documents. They're all in completely different places and it makes it really hard to pull everything together. There's also a huge amount of undocumented outcomes. Anyone that works in research, I think, knows that there's a real push for positive results, and it's what we all want, right? We're proud of our research. We want it to have this big impact. And there's a well-known publishing bias that comes with that, which is that research that has positive results is more likely to get published than negative or neutral results. And what we get is then the literature doesn't reflect the actual state of the research area, because for every one study that's published, there may be a couple more that actually didn't go quite to plan, and you lose all that nuance when you just look at the peer-reviewed literature. And finally, there's a huge amount of contextual variability. There are a huge number of different enhancement methods. I showed 3 there with the habitat panels, the rock pools, and the groin boulders. But I mean, you could go on for hours. People drill into boulders, people remove bricks from seawalls to increase that complexity. There are even examples of walkways in ports and marinas that are made with glass so that they don't cast shadows down on the coastline below. So there are all of these amazing ways of just making these changes to enhance and kind of build up these ecological measures. But that does make it quite hard to standardize across kind of a big scale and to draw large conclusions. So there's a huge amount of variability there. Equally, geographic variability. The majority of research so far has really come out of Australia, Western Europe, North America, and Singapore. It's hopefully increasing, definitely is with the kind of nature-based solution side in South Africa, thanks to Francesca's amazing work, and hopefully as well with the potential of a living seawall in Cape Town. But still, we see this big disparity in the research outputs from different areas. And there's a huge difference in geographical variables that can really impact the success of different projects. So it's really important that we get that full picture of how these interventions differ around the world. There are other things, obviously, to mention here. Material use differs, and that can impact ecological measures. The list goes on. So this evidence base is really fragmented, and it's really important that we try and bring it all together to create a good picture. Because otherwise, what happens is something like this, which is a bit of a strange analogy, but stick with me if you haven't seen this before. This is a group of people all looking at an elephant, but they are looking at it very close up, and each individual is looking at a different thing. So you've got a gentleman here who's looking at the tusks, saying it's a spear, and someone looking at the ears, claiming that it might be a fan. Its trunk, and it might be a snake, its legs, and it's a tree, its body, and it's a wall, and then its tail, and thinking it's a rope. So you see all of these people are looking at a tiny bit of evidence, and they're missing the bigger picture because it's they haven't zoomed out far enough. And this is really what happens when we focus on single case studies, specific bits of evidence. We feel like we've got this view of what something looks like, but actually, if you zoom out, things can look quite different. And so it's really important to make sure that we're trying to always get the big picture. So this brings me on to the aim of my first chapter of my PhD, which is not finished, but it is effectively trying to synthesize the existing knowledge of greening of grey infrastructure. So we're attempting a systematic review and meta-analysis, exploring the ecological effects of GGI using transparent, vigorous, and hopefully unbiased methods. And so as of this week, we heard that our protocol was accepted for publication, which is very exciting. This is a 40-page document of very strict methods and no results. It's just us explicitly saying exactly what we're going to do, how we're going to search for literature, making sure that we're using all of the terms we possibly can. We've had over 18 experts comment on our processes to ensure that we're using the right terms. For example, we call this greening of grey infrastructure, but they might not use that same term in Australia, for example. And so if we just search using the terms that we know, we may be losing out a whole load of literature there. We're also looking in multiple databases, and we're also investigating the grey literature, so government reports, industry reporting, to try and improve that full picture. And so hopefully over the next year, we'll start drawing together all of these different streams of evidence to provide a good foundation, building upon kind of all the work that's been done so far in terms of the ecological measures in regards to greening of grey infrastructure. So that's my first chapter, my first component of my PhD. On to the second challenge, unknown public perceptions. So research into the social perceptions of GGI is, as I said, really scarce in comparison to this ecological literature, which is really growing in popularity. And yet the implementation of GGI is really driven by social and economic factors. I can present and talk until the cows come home about how many extra limpets we got on this specific tile type and how that can really impact the biodiversity of a habitat. But if people think it's ugly, if they think it's too expensive, if they think it's unsafe, it's not going to be implemented. It's not just ecological measures that will drive success in future implementation. It really requires a more holistic approach and a better understanding. And if GGI isn't supported, it won't be implemented, and we won't gain any of these benefits back. So this takes me on to my next aim, which was to assess public perceptions of greening of grey infrastructure in Plymouth. We developed some questionnaires based on some similar questionnaires used in Australia, so we could have this comparative approach. And we amended them for a group of sector experts in the UK and members of the public. And then we took these questionnaires to workshops and 3 public events, which is why I'm dressed as a pirate. And we basically asked as many people as we could about their thoughts on greening of grey infrastructure. And I've presented just a couple of quick results, so I don't overload anyone, but this is basically investigating people's awareness of greening of grey infrastructure. So as you may imagine, sector experts who were classed as people that work in the natural or built environment, or policymakers in relation to coastal governance, were much more aware of GGI than members of the public were. So you can see here, this is the number of people that stated when they learned or when they became aware of GGI. Over 40% of experts that we questioned had been aware of GGI for over 5 years. This is obviously a very different story when you're talking to the public, where 40% of the people we spoke to learned about GGI when we gave them the questionnaire. So it's definitely not as easy as saying that people are aware or people aren't aware. there are obviously huge differences. And so this really shows that despite Plymouth having multiple previous GGI projects due to the university there, awareness was still very low amongst members of the public. That is not to say, however, that they weren't supportive. We asked each person we gave them a series of 5 positive statements about GGI, and they could rank each statement between 1 and 5. 1 was that they strongly disagreed with the statement. 5 was that they strongly agreed with the statement. We averaged out those responses, and each individual got a support score, a GGI support score. And as you can see, both on average were very high, with 5 being very supportive across all measures of GGI, and 1 being not supportive at all. You might notice, interestingly, that the public were more supportive than sector experts, which was contrary to what we hypothesised in the beginning. We think this could be due to a couple of reasons. There's an inherent bias with social studies when you are asking a questionnaire or asking people to fill in a questionnaire at an environmental stall, at an environmental kind of public event. You're more likely to get people who are more environmentally minded answering your questionnaire. So it's likely that people were kind of naturally more supportive because it aligned with their values. We also think the public possibly had a less nuanced understanding of greening of grey infrastructure. I've just presented a fair amount of kind of challenges associated with GGI that sector experts are likely aware of because they engage with it regularly, whereas the public might not have been. So it really kind of untangled some interesting patterns when we looked at awareness and support. But generally, we found strong support and positive perceptions of GGI from both sector experts and members of the public. And to support wider uptake of GGI, future efforts should focus on broadening communication beyond just the scientific community, because we know that that awareness is still low in the general public. And it's really important that for GGI that there's broad-based support. If anyone has any interest in this, there were lots of other results that I obviously couldn't present today. We investigated willingness to pay, using like increased council tax and different taxation methods. We also looked at some of the aesthetic values, how people describe preferences between bare seawalls versus more biodiverse seawalls. So there's lots to unpick there if anyone's interested. And on to the third challenge, which is why I got the fantastic opportunity to come here to SAIAB. And it's the reliance on hard enhancements. So the majority of greening practices still use hard engineering approaches, as I mentioned before. Despite possible positive ecological outcomes, there are obviously risks when we're just putting more concrete on our coastlines. There is a high carbon footprint of enhancements. If you're making these big habitat panels, you can't be doing it for nothing. If there's going to be no benefit, it's really not worth the kind of the carbon that goes into creating these things. So it's really important that you kind of have a good understanding of the successes in the various contexts that you're working in. There's also the requirement for ongoing maintenance. If you have funding for 2 years and it's in the water and then at the 5-year mark something happens, who's responsible for that? And that is much more significant when you're working with large kind of concrete structures. There's also a very real risk of greenwashing, which is touched on a lot in the GGI literature. It has been referred to as a Trojan horse for coastal development. There is a very real risk that, for example, if someone wanted to build a new port and it was deemed unacceptable, it was said that it was going to do too much damage to the environment. What we don't want is someone coming back with new proposed plans with the same port with a couple of habitat panels on it, because that's not acceptable. It's not good enough. This isn't a kind of band-aid that you can chuck on anything that might do some potential damage to ecosystems. It's best placed enhancing structures that are already there. And so it's really important that that is carried through. But these are all risks basically associated when you're using more and more concrete. So what we are trying to do is incorporate more nature-based solutions. And we've done this using a fantastic help from the Kais Trust in the Amizi project with Francesca. And the plan is to use Amizi to make our coasts more healthy. So Amizi is a sedge grass. Sorry, that's a very low quality picture when it's blown up this big. And it's been traditionally used in indigenous weaving practices for baskets and mats. And there's a huge amount of knowledge in local communities as to how to utilise these structures. Vuyo has done an amazing project exploring this in more detail, which I'm so excited to read. But yeah, it has this historical use, and we really think that it has some scope for enhancing our coastlines as well. So we focused on mussels for this project. Mussels have a huge number of services associated with them. They're fantastic for water filtration. You can see here just a quick image of a tank with mussels and a tank without mussels. You can see the tank with no mussels has got this dirty water, whereas the tank with mussels, those mussels have filtered through that water. And it's just a very obvious and very clear way of showing how valuable they are for our coastlines, especially as our coastlines are becoming more kind of industrial. We also use them for food, and when they're grown for food, they're grown on these ropes in aquaculture. And what we find is that mussels favourably settle on filamentous material, and so ropes really suit mussels very well. The way they attach using byssal threads are very suitable for this kind of method of aquaculture. And so what our aim is to use Amizi to attract mussels onto coastal infrastructure. So the fantastic Kais Trust have braided these ropes made out of this Amizi structure. And what we did was we basically wrapped concrete panels with these Amizi fibres. We attached them to beams. Sorry to anyone that wanted to use the garage downstairs during all of October, because we slightly monopolised it. But we attached 40 tiles, 20 of which were left bare, 20 of which were wrapped in fibres. And we deployed them in the port of Port Elizabeth for 12 weeks. And this is a photo of them underwater. And we basically wanted to investigate how we could attract mussels using these fibres. So this is what our tiles look like after 12 weeks in the water. You can see there's a fair amount of growth on them. Lots of ascidians, there were seaweeds, we saw crabs, worms, all kinds of stuff. They were really getting on well. At 12 weeks, the mussels that we were looking for were still a little bit too small to do anything at this scale. So we began processing them by cutting the Amizi fibres, scraping and brushing everything down, unbraiding those fibres and making sure that we were getting any small recruits out. And then retaining everything that had come off those tiles in these large buckets. We then sieved all of that content and were left with just the sediment and just the stuff that had come off those tiles. And we investigated that under microscope, and we found mussels, which was fantastic. So we saw mussels from all kinds of stages. We saw very tiny, like very new settlers, all the way up to larger recruits, some of which you could see with the naked eye. And so it was really fantastic to see how these mussels were living on these tiles. So I'm still processing these tiles. I've got quite a few more to do upstairs. But so far, we have seen a pattern in Amizi tiles harbouring more mussels on them. So there was a larger average number of mussel recruits on the tiles that were wrapped in Amizi fibres when compared to the bare tiles, which was really fantastic to see. So it does show that there does seem to be an impact and effect of having those fibres wrapped around those tiles. This is really fantastic and super promising for community collaboration. It's been such an amazing experience working with the Kais Trust, and it's fantastic to see that there was some seemingly real impact of using these nature-based solutions to better enhance our coastlines. And this can hopefully be scaled up to a stage where we're not wrapping them necessarily around these concrete tiles. We're enhancing in different ways using these natural fibres. And I've just got some key references there if anyone's interested, looking at different kind of GGI aspects from the social perceptions to the nature-based solution stuff. There's a big mix. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Jess. When you say positive results, that's what we like. And I just we're going to get on a round of questions online and on the floor, but I just wanted to add that this feedback has been given 2 days ago to the community, to our collaborators. We went to the Kreiskammer Trust to Hamburg, and Jess, of course, it was a different type of, a slightly adapted type of presentation, translated thanks to Vujo and Isik Rosa. And it was an incredible opportunity also to show and to bring the samples there that they have been asking, what are these braided things collecting? And they could see that under the microscope, there's like those baby mussels, the Belliger, they're all competent and recruits. So yes, so it's a story that is evolving and is evolving in parallel. Sometimes it's, or rather integrated or woven rather, not in parallel with the community. So I'm just leaving it there. Thank you so much for the incredible overview. Questions from the floor first, and then I'm going to go online. Yes, we know.
Muscles that are now trying to anchor onto them.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually kind of one of the foundational questions that led us to ropes in the first place. So the longevity of the fibres depends on the natural environment they're in. We attach them fairly securely around the back of the tile, and so we were still checking on them very regularly to make sure that they were still there, but that will depend massively. I think you've had experiences ranging from very short periods of time in very rough environments to much longer durations in calmer environments. The main thought process behind the using of the ropes, as opposed to using more of a continuous mat of woven fibres, was that mussels can move post-settlement to underlying hard structures. And so what we didn't want is for things to settle onto the fibres and then for them to fall off and for the whole community to be gone. By having the ropes kind of with chunks of concrete or hard structure underneath, it would allow the settlers to move post-settlement onto the underlying concrete and to hopefully establish there, allowing them to continue to thrive and to provide habitat for other organisms, even once the ropes had kind of disintegrated or been lost. So that was kind of the long-term plan for the use of the ropes.
And there were a couple of odd ones that had attached.
Yeah.
On the back, they were already largish enough to be seen.
Just observationally, as we were taking the measy fibres off, all that we saw of the larger mussels that you could see with the naked eye were underneath those lines of fibres. They were very concentrated along those stretches. So it did seem like there was some post-settlement movement afterwards. Obviously, I'll hopefully be able to untangle some of that in the kind of data analysis down the line. But yeah, just from a very early standpoint, it did seem like there was some of that kind of happening in practice.
Yeah, so down.
Exactly. Yeah. And hopefully that itself will then provide biological complexity that allow other organisms to come in. So it's not just providing habitat for mussels, that's kind of the first stage. And then as soon as you have that complexity and that moisture retention that happens whenever there's any kind of change in topographic complexity, hopefully that will encourage further organisms on as well.
Yes, Lucky.
Fantastic presentation, Jess. I think you're a great speaker. I'd like to commend you on looking at an environmental issue and also considering people that rely on that environment as well. So well done on considering the public perception of your science around people. So do you see any potential for perhaps working with a social scientist? I think your research presents a great opportunity to be a transdisciplinary type of project. And just the second question, have you had any thoughts about what you want to perhaps do to increase awareness and support public support perhaps for the greening of grey infrastructures. So maybe what are your plans? Do you have any, have you thought of those kind of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So first question, yes, we would love to engage more people in the kind of execution of further social studies using social scientists and also in kind of a global environment. I didn't get the chance here to compare to the results that were found in Australia, but we can make comparisons there as well. They also found very high levels of support. And so there is hopefully scope for an increasing kind of number of global locations performing social perception studies, because there will be a huge amount of difference, you imagine, between different locations. And so, yes, we do hope to make that more transdisciplinary and also on a larger global scale as well. And secondly, regarding the kind of raising awareness, absolutely. In Plymouth, we do a lot of work with local charities and local communities. So there's a charity called the Rockpool Project, and they've been hosting rockpool safaris in the natural environment for some years now. But they've also now added as a kind of extra this living seawall safari. So they can go. The great thing about the one in Plymouth is you can walk down next to it. So you can get up and you can look in the rock pools. You can like hold up the big kind of fucus seaweeds and see underneath them. And so that provides a great opportunity for young kids. We've also got very recently, there's a school competition ongoing at the moment where children are designing their own tiles. We've done a project, we did an event where we went to our local scrap store and got loads and loads of their recycled stuff, and we laid everything out on a big table, and kids could basically make their own DIY tiles using these kind of cardboard cutouts. So hopefully the profile is gradually increasing. It's just trying to raise the number of kind of mentions we can get in response to the local community, and hopefully that will kind of spread out onwards from there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lucky. Yes, Will.
Amazing talk, Jess. I wanted to find out from the social perspective, how did the business people feel? Did they support the GGOs?
Yeah, so the built environment kind of professional business people were generally supportive. That was our smallest group that was represented in the sector expert category. I go a fair amount into the caveats of the kind of the number of people that we could get for the social perception study in the full paper. But generally they were very supportive, and there are a number of companies now in the UK that are working on implementing structures such as these. And so broadly they were supportive, but I would love to have another stab at getting a larger number of people to get a more reflective opinion on those.
Thank you. Can I just link to, I'm coming to you, Taryn, but it's very linked to Voya's question. And my question was of that sector, and you kind of responded, but I would be interested, at least in our experience, engineers from the port seems to be the hardcore sector that we tend to fail in convincing with and authorities. So port authorities, engineers, where do you see, if you said your numbers was low, but where do you see a possible amelioration improvements of these relations so that that they will allow to drill that hole in the wall? They're very concerned about structural risk onto the entire structure. So how do we make those conversations a little bit more well, the two categories can really talk to one another and be reassured?
Yeah, I think it does require very frank conversations about any potential risks that they're worried about. You can imagine that drilling into a structure that's designed not to be drilled into, it does flag some questions. But then on the other hand, when people deploy a ladder in a port, they're drilling into a seawall, for example. So there are conversations that need to be had to kind of come to a middle ground. Perhaps it is finding a slightly different way to enhance them, or making sure that, drilled holes are filled with epoxy, or there are different ways of kind of approaching the implementation, and it's not going to be the same anywhere. So it's just, I think, really listening to the points on both sides. I know in Plymouth, we have a lot of heritage walls. Our ports are like, they were really old, and there was a lot of conversations about where we could actually put the living seawall. And we ended up being kind of shoehorned into one place, which was where a part of the heritage wall had collapsed and then been rebuilt. And so we had very up-to-date kind of engineering reports on the wall itself, and there was less of a risk of kind of public outcry about drilling into a heritage wall. It's so on such a case-by-case basis. There are going to be different factors in different locations, but I think it is just about having those honest conversations and discussing the points from both sides.
Thank you. Taryn, yes.
No, just that was a really great talk. I really enjoyed that. It's kind of following on from what Francesca was saying. So I can understand the engineer's concern about the integrity of the wall and everything, and it kind of leads into public engagement and stuff as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is the wall in Plymouth like an easily accessible place? It's not in like a closed port. So in your opinion, do you think, let's take the engineers out of the mix, do you think there would be more support where people can physically see the wall in a place that they frequent quite often? So like in Port Alfred, for example, where the walls going out of the estuary are, so they can see it and go, wow, look at that, relative to a port where they actually can't access, where arguably it's needed more to suck out all the bad stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And I think it's quite a complex thing to kind of balance. So the location we worked in Plymouth, we were quite lucky. So it's a marina. There's a closed section and then an open section. So we were on the open section that allowed for normal tidal flow and everything like that. But it coincides with a very busy like recreational hub. There's all kinds of stuff there. There's bars and restaurants that go right along. And people really did appreciate being able to see it. I think people like to get on board with a tangible conservation project that they really feel like it's in their local area. They feel like they're involved. And so that was really great to see that support. And you're right, the fact they could access it, I think really did bolster that. But you're absolutely correct that perhaps the places where the public aren't the best locations for an ecological perspective. There may be places where, for example, really heavy industry ports might benefit more from these kind of structures. I think it's a balancing act of this being a very early science, and it really needing some like public awareness to get it going. Perhaps like you speak to, I've spoken to like harbour masters who work around the UK who have never heard of projects such as these, even though they work in their ports on a really regular basis. And so I think once that profile is raised, there'll be more scope to putting it exclusively in areas that have maybe really bad water quality that aren't accessible to the public. But to kind of get that support and to maybe raise those funds as well in the first instance, it is really beneficial to have it in an environment where people can engage with it.
Okay, we get to Nina and then we're going to get back to you.
Just on you were saying the longevity of these projects and funding. So obviously the Plymouth Living Seawalls in there and sort of the ones in Australia. Are there long-term monitoring projects going on to kind of continue this to see what it looks like after 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So in Plymouth, I know we had an ecological PhD project, my colleague Franz Bauer. So he did 3.5 years of work associated with the project, which included two years of monitoring. And then once that round of funding, which was funding a person's basically full-time job working associated with this, now that that's run out, we have got plans to maintain research through a mix of approaches. The council are running monitoring, and also there'll be the ongoing involvement of university students, likely master's projects that don't have the kind of budget associated with them, but that will result in long-term monitoring. It definitely isn't going to be left behind. With a project of that scale, it's easier to do it at that level. There are other installations So, for example, the World Harbour Project, if anyone's familiar, was a smaller scale but global study where single habitat tiles, actually the tiles that we used to wrap the fibres, those were World Harbour Project tiles, which is from a previous project where I think 14 locations globally deployed these single tiles. And they were then all collected in to do the final analysis and the final research. So they're the kind of short-term projects where you couldn't even go and see them if you wanted to, because they were taken in, and that project was finished at that point. So we have long-term plans for the living seawall, and there's still a lot of kind of interest in it in Plymouth, which is really great. But a lot of these projects don't allow for that, whether that be for licensing, for funding, for any of these reasons. So hopefully there'll be an increase in these kind of larger, more permanent projects to kind of carry the momentum on, even after the initial span of research is maybe a little bit restricted.
And to add, Nina, these are the conversations that we're trying to have when we get to this agreement with the organization. If we're bringing it to Cape Town, one of the partners would be Two Oceans. So there are discussions to say, okay, we're doing the experimental phase with the training of someone in the Two Oceans Aquarium Foundation, and then they come in. Also, the type of monitoring or long-term monitoring wouldn't be as intensive as during the first phase. So you can say first you go six months, and then you can do it the yearly type of monitoring. So it kind of dilute the efforts. And then if you can find organizations that can monitor, keep on monitoring, would be great. In a harbor like Transnet, I'm thinking example setting, it would be a little bit more complex. But then if they want to do that, we either help them training with that type of monitoring, or we could try, if we could find funding, to say once yearly we could continue with the monitoring of that.
And that reflects the kind of succession as well. In the early stages, there are big changes very quickly. You see suddenly it's all green, and then suddenly it's all brown, and then fucus starts coming in. Those changes happen quite rapidly, within weeks, months. Whereas once that community is stabilized a little bit more, barring any large kind of environmental change, we can predict that those changes will kind of stabilize out a bit, and the fluctuations won't vary so much. So you can go to that yearly monitoring without risking kind of losing too much of that nuance. It's just important in the early stages to really get as fine scale a data as you possibly can.
Taryn, yes.
Yeah, it's almost like you need buy-in from the municipality or Transnet or some greater authority that has these areas.
Yeah.
So you could keep this long-term monitoring student projects going, but they provide just a little bit of running expenses.
Exactly.
And kind of cover those costs. Yeah. This was all these thoughts going to my head. Do the wall panels go down below the tidal level? So would there be scope to have them, above tide, so fully exposed, but then also down to like the bottom of a port wall, for example? And then in terms of the long-term monitoring, you've got those rapid changes that happen within a couple of weeks, couple of months, but there could be scope for pairing it up with something like not even bruvs, just bruvs that are monitoring the middle fauna, and just seeing how an increase in, let's call it primary productivity, primary critters results in sort of a succession of other animals moving to the area.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge scope for that, definitely. So the living seawall in Plymouth is completely within the intertidal zone. So at very low tide, we walk up to it, it's completely exposed, and then at high tide, it's always completely covered. But in Australia, there are examples of complete subtidal interventions. They're deployed, I think, off pier legs, and they're underwater at all times.
Structures
Yeah.
that they're like hanging in between pier poles.
Exactly.
And they're fully submerged.
Yeah, and they have, I think, a mix of scuba surveys and also, like remote operated vehicle kind of stuff
Where's
as
Kate
well.
now?
Yeah,
They
she's
use
in
ROV.
Florida,
Yeah,
I
in
think.
Florida they're using ROVs.
Yeah.
As well.
But again, that's just a slightly enhanced cost
Yes,
versus
exactly.
me going down and So yeah, it's definitely a toss up, but yeah, there's huge scope. And I mean, having a single installation that crossed across all of those environments would be fascinating, and it would be really, really valuable to look at. But yeah, it's all a matter of cost.
Two things. I'm coming to you, Peter, as well. The MESI project itself had a component where Carrier and Kolani and now Sue, we looked at RAVs to see if there was, even during high tide, so these were intertidal installations, if there was utilization by bigger fauna. And this was RAV and a combination of eDNA as well. We're finalizing, in fact, I'm finalizing a brief on that. The idea, yes, it's also we're trying to convince and to get us our own mini ROV, because we don't know if we manage to, we're still negotiating where to deploy in Cape Town. It might just be complex to do a diving because some of the canals are not exposed to a tidal fluctuation, but it seems like at the moment that's all they are allowing us to do. So there is scope. One challenge with that is visibility. So if the water is turbid, the ROV won't work. So that's the one challenge. Yes, Peter.
Great talk, Jess. I'm curious about kind of taking a big step back, what the underlying goal here is. So I can imagine if you're leveraging the colonization process, that you create a habitat that's unlike this human created habitat that fosters colonization. And so you have kind of a collection of the regional fauna, but where it's not conducive to completing life cycles or to becoming an island, if you will, that can contribute to source sink dynamics or metapopulations. So I can imagine two really different approaches to these living seawalls. One is just, let's see what's there. Let's see what colonizes. Let's get the public attention to the issue. The other is kind of designing in from the start at MPA thinking type of how is it connected? Can we complete life cycles, et cetera?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is the next step, definitely, is looking at it from a much more kind of holistic approach, looking at those kind of full life cycle assessments, because you're absolutely right. At the moment, it's very kind of early stage thinking. In line with that, it's likely that these interventions will start being included at the kind of built level instead of retrofitting things, where, for example, if a seawall's being remade, it kind of involving that from the get-go, that could then provide a wider array of habitat that could facilitate those kind of later stages. The living seawall in Plymouth has got there's a full paper coming out on this by my colleague. But in terms of communities in respect to local rocky shores, it does have the large brown seaweeds that we see. It has got some of those later life stages. So it is just a matter of scaling that up and making sure that works for the kind of connectivity. We're working in Plymouth. It's the first national marine park in the UK, Plymouth Sound. And so I definitely think there's interest to look at this from a kind of connectivity point of view, involving modelling and things like that to make sure that we're putting things in the right places. But first we need, or there's, you could say that we need that kind of on the ground implementation to make sure that we've got kind of the ground truth information to make sure that we're running everything correctly. So I think hopefully that's definitely the plan, but it's just there's a little bit of work for us to do first.
Yep. Thanks.
Also, Peter, I think the fact that, for example, in this specific study, most of the mussels currently present on the ropes that hold onto the boat are, fun enough, the indigenous one, penna, and the majority of the spat that we get from Jess's studies are penna as well. So yes, you could start stressing, I think maybe with genetic work as well. Are these environment creating some stepping stones to natural adjacent rocky shores in terms of connectivity and so on and so forth? But the Wall Harbour project, it's slightly deviating from the connectivity issue, but that we did in East London show that on the tiles that we deployed, there were no invasive species, although there is presence in the port of that. So all of these consideration can be made with additional level of the studies and really trying to think about that as there is an eMarco connectivity conference at the end of the year somewhere and I thought in September, I thought I wonder if this type of concept from an early stage perspective, could you talk about port or enhanced port could be becoming better or more effective in stepping stoning connectivity for species. All right, I think that there's no question from the online people. Jabulani, I'm very unimpressed. You didn't ask any question. But thanks once again, and thanks for this really engaging audience. It's really been great to have a great presenter brings an engaging audience, I guess. So thank you so much, Jess, and all the best for the rest of your PhD journey. And we're here for more collaboration. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.